All right, we're recording. Just for the sake of contextual stuff, Paige is subbing in. Miss Briggs, if you're watching this, because we literally can never get a hold of Emilio. Um, we've worked out the kinks in the past hour and 8 minutes. So let's get this party started. All right, everyone other than Paige, please mute yourself, and we can begin.
Okay. The United States Supreme Court should strike down the death penalty in the United States on the grounds that it violates the Eighth Amendment prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. The Supreme Court is necessary to abolish the death penalty. They should declare it unconstitutional on Eighth Amendment grounds. If the death penalty is to be abolished through the U.S., that will have to be done by the U.S. Supreme Court. Breyer laid out the roadmap for declaring death penalty unconstitutional. Three fundamental defects: makes the death penalty cruel and unusual punishment and therefore a violation of the Eighth Amendment. The first serious defect is the serious unreliability of the death penalty, the likelihood that some innocent individuals were wrongly executed. There is significantly more research-based evidence indicating that courts sentence to death individuals who may well be actually innocent. The second serious defect is arbitrariness. It would be unconstitutional if inflicted in an arbitrary and capricious manner. It is usually not the righteousness of the crime, but rather other factors which case defendants to be sentenced to death: race of both the defendant and the victim, gender of the defendant, the place where the crime was committed, the lack of resources available to defense counsel, quality of defendant's legal representation, and the political pressures on the judges who must stand for reflection. The third defect is the unconscionability, long delays that undermine the death penalty's logical purposes. Lengthy delays undermine both the deterrence and the retributive rationales of the death penalty. A penalty that serves no useful purpose is therefore cruel. The decision should not be left to the United States. The Supreme Court should deal with the death penalty its final blow. New York Times 17. The rest of the developed world agreed to reject this cruel and pointless practice long ago. How can it be ended here for good? Leaving it up to individual states is not the solution. The death penalty holdouts are fiercely committed, and they won't stop killing people unless they're forced to. Relying on the vague idea of attrition absolves the court of its responsibility to be the ultimate arbiter and guardian of the Constitution, and specifically of the Eighth Amendment. The court has already relied on that provision to ban the execution of juvenile offenders, the intellectually disabled, and those convicted of crimes other than murder. There's no reason not to take the final step to end the death penalty for good. U.S. Supreme Court's action is modeled internationally and serves as a foundation for international human rights law. Krotzinski, 2009. Barak of the Supreme Court of Israel tied these developments directly to the contribution of U.S. constitutional law. United States Supreme Court decisions in particular have always been, to me and to many other judges in modern democracies, shining examples of constitutional thought and constitutional action. The U.S. is the richest and deepest source of constitutionalism in general and judicial review in particular. We foreign jurists all look to developments in the U.S. as a source of inspiration. The U.S. can export legal ideas and structures abroad. Organized interactions between national judiciaries are both stronger and broader than ever before. Judges themselves believe that they are engaged in a transitional judicial enterprise that is not limited to the laws enacted by their local domestic governments. Constitutional courts will be forging a deeply pluralist and contextualized understanding of human rights law as it spans countries, cultures, and national and international institutions. Advantage 1, innocence. Continued use of the death penalty leads to the death of innocent people. Tribe 2017. Too many condemned people are innocent in the modern era of the death penalty. 160 people have been exonerated and freed from death row because of evidence that they were wrongly convicted. A painstaking study from the National Academy of Sciences includes that 4 out of every 100 people sentenced to death in the U.S. are innocent. Even 1 in 1,000 would be unacceptable. The court should acknowledge that capital punishment violates human dignity and constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. Even the risk of killing innocent people is intolerable and must be rejected. Barry 2019. Killing an innocent person obviously serves no compelling state interest. It is murder. The execution of a legally and factually innocent person would be an intolerable event. The substantial risk of executing a legally and factually innocent person is intolerable. Execution under the Federal Death Penalty Act to foreseeable state-sponsored murder of innocent human beings. We should have zero tolerance when life is on the line, and justifies the means approach only justifies more violence. Mims 2018. The death penalty also creates problems domestically. More than 2/3 of America's death sentences are overturned on appeal. We should have zero tolerance for mistakes when someone's life is on the line. If the government becomes a lawbreaker, it breeds contempt for law. To declare that in the administration of the criminal law, the end justifies the means. To declare that the government may commit crimes in order to secure the conviction of a private criminal would bring terrible retribution. Finally, the government has become a role model. It's sending a message that violence is the province of the powerful. Americans should consider studies showing that homicide rates increase where the death penalty is used and decrease where it is not used. Therefore, in our attempts to prevent crime with capital punishment, we are in fact encouraging it. Advantage 2, international human rights. The U.S. stance on death penalty undermines the willingness of other nations to respect human rights. Mims 2018. The U.S. claims to be the global leader in international human rights, but it continues to impose the death penalty and criticizes other countries for violating international human rights. The U.S. death penalty system allows racial disparities and executes the mentally ill. The U.S. also permits ineffective assistance of counsel. What this country does with respect to the death penalty affects the attitudes of other countries towards the U.S., as well as their willingness to respect human rights. Banning the death penalty is crucial to U.S. credibility on human rights law. Mims 2018. The death penalty is a form of punishment in the United States may play a significant role in terminating cordial relations in the future with countries that have abolished the death penalty. The U.S. also opens itself to condemnation from countries whose laws are consistent with international human rights standards. When we tell the world that we expect all people to abide by our laws, we cannot in the same breath tell the world that we need to do the same. The U.S.'s credibility when it continues to violate the right to life, harms relationships with other countries. Spain announced that it would not extradite Algerian terrorist suspects if the death penalty would be sought. England, America's principal ally, also declared that if it captured bin Laden, it would not extradite him to the United States if the death penalty would be sought. The U.S. cannot lecture other countries on the rule of law and of respecting international human rights if will not abide by those laws and rights itself, especially those laws protecting the right to life. U.S. support for human rights prevents a large-scale conflict. Green 2017. The U.S. has benefited immensely from the liberal world order that it helped create. From the ashes of World War II, America invested in interlocking institutions based on universal human rights that would prevent large-scale conflicts. U.S. support for human rights matters in people's lives. There's no other country that can substitute for the U.S. when it comes to fighting for universal freedoms. The solidarity expressed by the U.S. political leaders has provided sustenance and hope to human rights defenders in the grimmest conditions. The U.S. needs to make sure that those bravely fighting against repression and injustice all around the world know that they have not been forgotten. U.S. embrace of human rights is crucial to solving human rights violations around the globe. Bellinger 2018. It precisely because such freedoms are not inevitable that America active role in protecting and advancing them. This requires their vigorous promotion. The U.S. as an actor as well as exemplar, embracing the cause of basic rights and freedoms gives purpose and direction to America's role in the world. Standing up for fundamental rights makes the world safer for Americans and makes us stronger. Governments that respect the rights of their citizens remain the best vehicle for prosperity and peace. America is respected around the world for its commitment to human rights and the rule of law. To resist growing restrictions and the freedom of the world, U.S. leadership is necessary to reverse this trend. That is all the time that I have. I now stand open for cross-examination.
Okay, let me get a timer started first.
Yeah.
This is tag team, right?
Yes, this is tag team. So, okay, 3 minutes. Are we ready?
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's get this started. Okay, just to start off, could you clarify each of your advantages very quick for me?
Okay, so our first advantage is innocence, and then the second advantage is international human rights, and then yeah, that's it.
Okay, so when you talk about innocence, what exactly do you mean? Actually, no. So, explain to me what soft power is.
Well, basically soft power. Luken, would you like to elaborate?
Is that supposed to be an extension, if I can?
What was that, Sophia?
Sorry, is that supposed to be an extension on like your international human rights? Is that supposed to be for like United States power, such as hegemony, stuff like that?
It's basically that it's necessary for us to abolish the death penalty in order to preserve the US's credibility with human rights worldwide. And in order to do that, we need to abolish it, like I said. But it's basically saying that the US is key in fighting for
Really
human
fast,
rights
if I may
nationwide.
interrupt, you talk about like the United States power that they have over other countries, and you talk about how U.S. execution sets a precedent for other countries. What about other countries like Saudi Arabia that thinks it's okay to execute people based off the fact that they could be gay, or just
That's what we have to set an example for. We have to set an example that human rights matter to all people, no matter what religion, culture, or sex, and that we have to be the example for it, which is why we need to ban death penalty.
Okay,
what
I'm
makes
gonna
you think
jump
that's
in.
going to happen? Okay.
Okay, sorry. Can I ask a question real quick?
Yeah.
So you mentioned multiple times. You said that. Crap. Okay, how can other countries not? So you said that other countries cannot substitute for the United States in the fight for freedoms overall and like in the world. How is that true? How can other countries not substitute for them and provide an example as well?
The US has the most global reach with military power, and because that, it gives us a lot of example in foreign power, not militaristically, but example wise, and how they follow suit with it. We have to set the example, and because of that, we need to ban human rights, like I've said.
If I may
Okay.
interject, though, what makes you think that that's going to set a precedent for other countries? Because we have to remember that the execution of these gay people, or just people in general that don't abide by guidelines, like think China, for example, who's speaking against your country can get you killed. What makes you think that the United States setting guidelines for these other powerful countries is going to result in a lack of execution or death penalty?
Well, we've already seen some progressiveness with the Saudi Arabia, for example. They recently passed a law allowing women to go to soccer competitions and games, which is a huge progressive movement
Okay,
if
I'm
you think
sorry, I'm
in
gonna-
past years. And because of that, we can see that they're actually changing
Okay, I'm gonna cut
their
you
culture
short
to be
real quick.
more open to new ideas,
Yeah,
progressivism.
okay, please let me squeeze this one last question. And so you said if the government becomes a lawbreaker, which I would say is kind of an oxymoron because the government breaks laws regularly, especially like the executive branch. So what did you mean when you said if the government becomes a lawbreaker? What?
We can move that into the next
Yeah,
context
okay.
if you want, but we're out of time. I don't think I need any prep time for this next speech. I already have something prepped out. For a
Right.
quick off-time roadmap, I'm just going to be going over some of your, let's see. I'm first going to start with death penalty, then I'm going to move on to your innocence, then I'm going to move on to IHR, and then soft power, and if we have time, an extension. Okay. Before I start, is there anybody that is not ready? Okay, great. Starting now. The first thing that I want to start off with is I want to start off with the fact that the death penalty as of right now is actually at a low. Death penalty lowest use in decade. New York Times 20. Executions, new death sentences, public support for death penalty, lowest level in decades. Carried out fewer than 30 executions, imposed fewer than 50 new sentences, imposed 33 new death sentences, down from the 90s, more than 300 death warrants per year. Cut the card there. So essentially what that's going into is going into the fact that regardless of what our opponents are running, death penalty as of right now is actually at an all-time low. And as we progress, you can see that the death penalty is kind of solving itself. Next thing that I want to move on to is I want to move on to their innocence advantage. Governments are special moral agents that have the responsibility to maximize the public good. Lanton 2017. In their version of the argument from deterrence, governments are special moral agents and as collective agents, they have the moral obligation of maximizing the public good. Governments always have a moral obligation to act in face of wrongdoings, which in the present context are understood as private murders. Governments are special moral agents. Governments have a moral obligation to provide optimal deterrence for murders. Governments morally ought to retain capital punishments as an optimal deterrent. So essentially what that card is saying is it's going into the fact that as a government, they have to do all that they can to prevent these murders. And in that case, something such as a death penalty is actually going to act as a deterrence. The death penalty saves more innocent lives via deterrence, Latin 2017. The publication of a number of important works in econometry, according to which there is evidence that the death penalty may have a clear deterrence effort. The recent empirical studies which use sophisticated economic methods claim that capital punishment has a strong deterrence effect against violent crimes. Each execution saves 18 innocent lives. They mentioned in their last speech that the death penalty and the abolishment of the death penalty actually led to little violence in states that had them. However, this is a card that directly says that if anything, the death penalty acts as a deterrent and it encourages a lot of people who are considering a crime such as murder to stop. Next thing I want to move on to is I want to move on to human rights. Aggressively promoting human rights leads to conflicts. Walt 2017. Advancing human rights in different parts of the world is not necessarily the best way to produce peace. When the US overthrew Gaddafi largely for the human rights reasons in Libya, we ended up creating a failed state and a situation even worse than it was when we intervened. So well-intentioned efforts to advance human rights don't necessarily create a more peaceful world. We have to be very careful about our overzealous efforts because that actually could be an engine for conflict. This is something that you cannot rush. You have to let each society come to those conclusions pretty much on its own. So as we had mentioned during cross-examination is that we had asked, how are we going to encourage other countries such as Saudi Arabia or China to remove this unjust murder in the case where they are going to be murdering people for speaking out against them or simply being gay? And we didn't get a direct answer on how we would be able to encourage these countries when what they do, they've been doing for thousands of years before the United States had ever thought of intervening. Next thing I want to move on to is I want to move on to their soft power advantage. Trump's rhetoric and policies have trashed America's soft power. The death penalty is not the key issue. Trump's bombastic rhetoric and the America First agenda is eroding U.S. soft power. Experts say the U.S. slipped this year, an index that ranks the global leaders of soft power. The U.S. withdrawal from 3 major agreements, the TPP, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the Iran nuclear deal. These shifts in policy create an inconsistent and unpredictable U.S. foreign policy that gives America the paradoxical look of a great power in retreat. We have had a crisis of soft power and we haven't quite figured out how to solve it. Trump's America First agenda puts America's interests at the fore, even if the expense of maintaining relationships with US allies and at the expense of the nation's soft power. Trump's hardline stance on immigration and unwillingness to call out a white nationalist hurts the country's ability to claim the moral high ground on the world stage. Trump has destroyed the ability to have a working relationship because of childish behavior. So essentially what this card was going into is it was attacking their soft power advantage, where they said that we had to take this leadership role to deter people from executions and the death penalty in order to maintain a state of hegemony. But we can see because of deals that we have pulled out of, such as stated in this card, the Iran nuclear deal, that if anything, the death penalty is the last thing that we have to worry about when we talk about soft power and when we talk about upholding our state of hegemony. If anything, the death penalty is not going to be the thing that helps us get out of that. So, okay. Since I do have time, I'm going to go on to one more card. The justice system has been more sophisticated. Mistakes are less likely to occur, in 2017. The judicial system is better than before because no case of miscarriage of justice has happened since the restoration of capital punishment in the U.S. in 1976. Between 1973 and 2005, 120 people in the U.S. were released from death row because their cases were found sufficiently uncertain. O'Sullivan claims that this is good news because it shows his point. The judicial system is now more sophisticated and mistakes are less likely to occur. So they mentioned previously in their case that this was actually a bad thing, that people were being taken off of death row because of uncertainty. If anything, this just shows that the justice system is prepared and they're not going to unwillingly or unlawfully execute someone just based off a hunch. And you have to understand that often we do this and we go through this long trial and this long process to avoid this, a very expensive trial at that. Next thing that I have to mention is they mentioned the right to live, and they mentioned that every individual has this right to live. But when you're in prison, those rights are impaired, and it shows with privacy, the right to bear arms. And even once you get out of prison, that right is impaired. So when you talk about the right to live, if anything, we have to uphold the fact that murder in and of itself is unjust, and somebody on death row, possibly from rape charges or from murder charges, we have to uphold the innocence in this case. And I mentioned earlier in my speech that 17 lives can be saved by just one loss during the death penalty. And we have to consider that these people are on death row for a reason. So to summarize this case really fast, I just want to say that in terms of soft power, the last thing that we have to worry about is execution. In terms of innocence, the government is going to do what they can in order to uphold these moral rights. And we have to do what we can in order to uphold classical republicanism, in the sense that we can't let murderers run loosely or go without punishment. And in terms of international human rights, I can just summarize that by saying that it's shown in the past, nothing we do is going to sway it. And if anything, if we do try to aggressively promote these human rights, it's going to end up leading to conflict rather than it's going to lead to a resolution. So for these reasons and many more, I strongly urge a vote on the side of the negation. And I now stand open for cross-examination.
Okay, real quick. After this cross-examination, I'm going to end this meeting because we are running out of time. Then we will start a new meeting with the same recording. So this is kind of the...
You gotta make sure to post in Discord for me then.
Yes, I will.
Okay.
We will do that, and then we
So-
will be right back. But we're going to do
Yeah.
this cross-sex right now.
So Paige, what do you have? What's your question?
Wait, are we starting right now?
Cross-sex, yeah.
Okay.
Cross-sex begins. Yeah.
Okay, so in what you were saying, you said that these people are on death row for a reason, but I just don't really understand how, like what you had to say against our advantage of innocence, which was saying that the death penalty kills innocent people.
Right. So to answer that really fast, I did read a card at the very end that was basically saying that regardless, the judicial system is doing what they can in order to avoid people who are wrongfully accused. And regardless of the people that are on death row, and let's say hypothetically they've been accused for a right reason, or even they admitted to their crimes, we have to uphold the fact that there are innocent people and this person is on death row for a reason. So in the case of rape, in the case of murder, we don't want someone like that roaming around all the time, along with them having life in prison. It's just a matter of we have to uphold, in this case, the innocence and the average civilian in the sense of classical republicanism. So when we talk about that and when we talk about their reason for being on death row, they are on death row for a reason. Regardless, the judicial system is doing what they can in order to avoid wrongful executions.
Okay. Luken, did you have any questions that you?
You mentioned a card that goes directly against the one where death penalties in areas actually increase violence. Can I get the year?
Yeah, let me check.
That one.
Here, let me just go back to the document. So you're talking about its demoting conflict, right? So I didn't have a direct card that mentioned United States conflict in the sense where you guys had mentioned in your last speech that death penalty or a lack of in certain states led to minimum violence. I did, however, have a card, and the year on this is Walt 2017. It's my IHR advantage. And it's basically saying that promoting human rights leads to conflict where almost you're shoving it down people's throats. But unless I can get evidence or an example or a source on how a lack of death penalty leads to minimum violence, then I'm going to uphold the fact that death penalty, regardless, does not have any effect on the violence in a state. And if anything, we mentioned in the first few cards that I read that the death penalty almost acts as a deterrent, and it encourages people such as murderers or rapists to avoid committing crimes because they now realize that the punishment for their crime is much more severe.
That's all the questions I have.
Okay.
Moving on to part 2. Oh wait, before we end the meeting, Jack, Paige,
I'm
where
going to
did
stop
you?
recording real quick.
Okay, where did you